The scream cut through the August heat like a blade. It was the kind of scream that stops everything. Conversations mid-sentence, birds mid-flight, and the lazy turning of ceiling fans in open windows. It was not the scream of a child who had skinned a knee or dropped an ice cream cone or lost a toy. It was the scream of a child who was afraid in the oldest, most fundamental way, the way that bypasses thought entirely and goes straight to the spine. "Don't touch my sister." The boy was 9 years old. His name was Calvin Ray Beaumont, and he was standing in the parking lot of the Sundown Motor Lodge on Highway 9, 40 miles outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, with both fists raised in front of him and his chin shaking with the effort of not crying. He was wearing a green T-shirt with a dinosaur on it that was 2 sizes too big, shorts that had been washed so many times the original color was anybody's guess, and sneakers with mismatched laces, one white, one yellow, because that was what was available. He was 4 feet 6 inches tall. He was facing a man who was 6 feet 2. The man's name didn't matter. What mattered was his size, his posture, the way he'd grabbed the arm of the small girl standing beside Calvin, the girl who was 6 years old and whose name was Addie Beaumont, and who was now pressed behind her brother's raised fists, making herself as small as she possibly could while tears ran down her face in silence, the particular silence of a child who has learned not to cry out loud because crying out loud sometimes made things worse. The man laughed. Not a good laugh. "Move, kid," he said. "No," Calvin said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. It cracked because he was 9, and his voice was too young for this, and his body was too small for this, and every reasonable part of him understood that this situation had no good outcome for a 4'6" boy with mismatched shoelaces facing a man who had already shown he had no problem grabbing a 6-year-old girl. But he didn't move. "I said move," the man said again. Something darker in his voice now. Calvin raised his fists higher. What happened in the 60 seconds before Calvin screamed was this. He and Addie had been sitting on the concrete curb at the edge of the Sundown Motor Lodge parking lot, sharing a bag of chips that Calvin had bought with the last $1.40 he'd had in his pocket, trying to stay in the shade of the overhang while they waited. Waited for what was a complicated answer. They were waiting for their mother, Patricia Beaumont, who was inside room 14 of the Sundown Motor Lodge doing something Calvin didn't understand the full mechanics of, but understood enough to know it was the reason they were outside instead of in, the reason they were waiting instead of sleeping, and the reason things were the way they were and had been the way they were for the past 14 months. Before that, before the 14 months, things had been different. Not perfect. Calvin was old enough to remember that it hadn't been perfect. But there had been a house, a real house, with a backyard that had a broken swing set that his father had said he was going to fix but never did before he left. There had been a kitchen where his mother cooked on Sundays, real cooking, things that smelled like effort and care. There had been school, consistent school, the same school 2 years in a row with the same teacher who knew his name. Then his father had gone, and then the house had gone, and then school had become inconsistent, and then his mother had started being someone slightly different from who she'd been, someone he could still see inside the new version but had to look harder for. So there they were. Sundown Motor Lodge, parking lot, August, chips. Addie had been eating her chips with the focused concentration of someone performing an important task when the man came out of room 12, 2 doors down from their mother's room. Calvin had clocked him immediately. He'd developed the habit, over 14 months, of clocking adults in his immediate vicinity the way you tracked weather, looking for signs of what was coming. This man had the signs. He'd looked at Addie first. Calvin had seen him look, and the look was wrong, and something in Calvin's chest had tightened in the specific way it did when the weather was bad. He'd moved closer to his sister without saying anything, positioning himself between her and the man. The man had come over anyway, had said something to Addie that Calvin hadn't fully heard. And when Addie had tried to get up and back away, the man had grabbed her arm. That was when Calvin had gotten to his feet and screamed. The parking lot of the Sundown Motor Lodge was visible from Highway 9. Highway 9 was where 90 motorcycles were currently in the process of pulling off for a fuel and rest stop. 90 motorcycles. 107 riders. Members and associates of the Oklahoma chapter of the Hells Angels, returning from a 3-day run to a rally in Muskogee. They were tired, road-stiff, and loud with the particular noise of large groups in good spirits, the rumble of engines filling the air like weather. The parking lot of the Sundown Motor Lodge was adjacent to the Ridgeway gas station, which was where they decided to stop, which was why there were currently 90 motorcycles pulling into a space that usually held 30 cars, chrome and leather filling the August afternoon. The scream reached them through the engine noise. Most people would not have heard it. The engines were too loud, the distance was enough, and the ambient sounds of a highway rest stop are substantial. But a man named Thomas Wayne Briggs heard it. He'd been riding at the front of the formation, and he'd already killed his engine before the others, standing up on his pegs to assess the lot, looking for space. He was 56 years old. He'd been the road captain for the Oklahoma chapter for 11 years. He had the kind of hearing that came from 30 years of riding, of learning to filter the world through engine noise, of developing a sensitivity to sounds that didn't fit. A child's voice. "Don't touch my sister." Those exact words, sharp and desperate, cutting over the dying engines. He was moving before he'd fully processed what he'd heard. He didn't stop to think about it, didn't evaluate or consider it. Something in those 4 words bypassed every adult filter he'd built in 56 years. He walked toward the Sundown Motor Lodge parking lot. He was a large man. He'd been a large man since he was 16. 6'4", 240 pounds, and shoulders that people tended to give room to. He wore his leather cut over a black shirt, boots worn smooth with miles, and a beard that had gone gray at the edges. His arms were covered in ink from wrist to shoulder. He did not look like someone you wanted to be standing in front of when he was unhappy. He turned the corner of the gas station into the motel parking lot and took in the scene in under 3 seconds. A small boy, 2 fists up. A little girl behind him. A man twice the boy's size and with the posture of someone who was about to make things worse. Thomas Wayne Briggs covered 30 feet in approximately 4 seconds. He put himself between the man and the children. He didn't touch the man. He simply filled the space, stood in the way in the particular manner of a very large person who is comfortable with their own size and who has learned that size well-placed can be its own complete sentence. "Step back," Thomas said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing that people sometimes didn't expect, that the quietness was not weakness, that a voice didn't have to be loud to be absolute. The man looked up at Thomas, went through the stages, assessment, recalculation, the particular deflation of someone whose aggression has found a better target. He stepped back. "This isn't," he started. "Step back more," Thomas said. The man stepped back more. Behind Thomas, he could hear the sound of boots on asphalt. He didn't need to look. He knew what was behind him. He'd been riding with these people for 22 years. He knew their footsteps. Calvin didn't lower his fists. Not immediately. He'd raised them, and he was committed, and also his whole body was running on adrenaline that didn't have an off switch, and he couldn't quite process what had just happened. The enormous man in the leather jacket stepping in front of him like a wall appearing from nowhere. He looked up, and further up. The man was the biggest human being Calvin had ever seen in person. And behind him, Calvin looked around the man's enormous arm, were more men. And women. All of them in leather. Some of them had patches he didn't know how to read. Some of them with beards, and some without, and some of them older, and some younger, but all of them occupying the parking lot with a kind of absolute physical confidence that made the sundown motor lodge look smaller by comparison. Calvin slowly lowered his fists. Addie had stopped crying. She'd gone very still the way she did when she didn't know yet if things were better or worse. Thomas Briggs turned around, and Calvin braced himself. For what, he wasn't sure. He'd learned not to be sure what adult terms meant. Thomas looked down at him. His face was not soft exactly, but it was not hard either. It was something more complex than either of those things. It was the face of someone who was looking at him and actually seeing him, not as a problem or an inconvenience or a thing to be managed, but as a person. "You okay?" Thomas said. The question was so simple it almost broke Calvin completely. "Yes," Calvin said. His voice was working hard to be steady. "I'm okay. My sister's okay." Thomas looked past him at Addie. He crouched down, which was a remarkable thing to see, this large man making himself smaller, going to her level with the deliberateness of someone who had done this before. "Hey," he said to Addie. His voice shifted in some quality Calvin couldn't have named, but immediately felt. Softer, slower, the voice you used for frightened things. "What's your name?" Addie looked at him. She had her thumb near her mouth, which she did when she was scared, but she didn't put it in because she'd been told not to, and the effort of maintaining that instruction in the middle of being terrified was so specifically Addie that Calvin felt something twist in his chest. "Addie," she whispered. "Hey, Addie," Thomas said. "You're safe. Nobody's going to bother you. Okay." She looked at him for a long moment with the careful assessment of a 6-year-old who has learned not to trust reassurance automatically. Then she looked at Calvin. Calvin gave her a tiny nod. She looked back at Thomas and said, "Okay." The man from room 12 had melted away somewhere in the previous 30 seconds. He'd found a gap in the collection of leather-jacketed people filling the parking lot, and he'd moved through it, and then he'd kept moving, and the sound of a car starting on the far side of the lot confirmed what everyone already knew. Thomas stood up from his crouch and looked at Calvin. "How old are you?" he said. "9, Calvin said. Thomas nodded slowly. "Like this confirmed something." "That was a brave thing you did," he said. Calvin's chin was still shaking slightly from the adrenaline, which he was furious about because he didn't want to look like he was about to cry. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "You had a choice," Thomas said. "You made the right one." He looked around the parking lot, looking at Calvin and Addie on the curb, the chips bag between them. He sat down on the curb beside them, This enormous man in his leather and boots, lowering himself to curb level with the same deliberateness as the crouch. "Where's your mom?" Calvin looked at room 14 and back at Thomas. The question of where his mom was and what she was doing was not a simple one, and in his experience the full answer got adult faces doing complicated things and sometimes resulted in people being called, and people being called sometimes resulted in things Calvin desperately did not want to happen. "Inside," he said carefully. "She'll be out." Thomas looked at room 14, then back at Calvin. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it deepened. "When did you last eat?" he said. "We've got chips," Calvin said. "Before the chips." Calvin thought about it. They'd had something at a gas station yesterday morning. Those packaged donuts that tasted like sugar and nothing else. A long time ago. He didn't answer. Thomas looked at Addie, who was looking at the chips bag with the concentration of someone considering whether it was appropriate to keep eating in the current situation. "Addie," Thomas said, "are you hungry?" Addie looked at Calvin. He gave her another small nod. "Yes," she said quietly. Thomas stood up. He looked over his shoulder at the group of riders behind him. He found a face in the crowd, a woman in her 50s, solid and practical-looking, with silver hair pulled back. "Nora," he said. The woman came over. "Can you go get food?" he said. "Whatever they've got at the gas station. Sandwiches, fruit, whatever's real." The woman named Nora looked at Calvin and Addie with a swift, complete assessment of someone who'd seen need before and knew how to respond to it. "Yeah," she said. She moved. Thomas sat back down on the curb. Calvin looked at him. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Thomas said. "We're fine." "Okay. We don't need help." Thomas looked at him sideways. Not challenging. Not pitying. Just looking. "You stood up against a man twice your size to protect your sister," he said. "That's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing. But being tough enough to do that doesn't mean you can't accept a sandwich." Calvin stared at the asphalt between his mismatched lace sneakers. "I don't take things from people I don't know," he said. It came out more clipped than he meant. "My mom taught me that." "That's a good thing your mom taught you," Thomas said. "My name is Thomas Briggs. I have 2 daughters of my own. My youngest is your sister's age. I've been riding motorcycles for 33 years, and I'm going to tell you something straight. The reason I walked over here wasn't charity. It was because I heard you yell, and something told me I needed to be somewhere." Calvin looked up at him. "I'm not going to pretend I understand your situation," Thomas continued. "I don't. But I know what it looks like when someone's been carrying something heavy for a long time. And I know that accepting a sandwich from a stranger doesn't mean you're weak. Sometimes it just means the timing worked out." Calvin was quiet. "My dad left," Calvin said. He didn't know why he said it. It came out the same way things came out at 3 in the morning when you were too tired to guard them. "Mine too," Thomas said. "I was 7. Calvin looked at him. Thomas was looking at the highway, the motorcycles still pulling into the gas station lot next door. His face in profile was weathered and uncomplicated. "What did you do?" Calvin asked. "The same thing you did," Thomas said. Figured out I was the oldest person still there and acted like it. Addie had moved slightly during this conversation. Still close to Calvin, always close to Calvin, but no longer pressed entirely behind him. She was looking at the motorcycles. Not with fear. With the pure, uncomplicated fascination of a 6-year-old who had never seen 90 motorcycles in one place before and found the spectacle too interesting to let fear win. "Are those yours?" she asked Thomas. He looked at her. The almost smile. "Some of them," he said. "All of them. Our clubs. We ride together. Like a team. Like a family," he said. Addie considered this with the seriousness she brought to important information. "Calvin and me are a family," she said. "We're a team, too." "Yeah," Thomas said, looking at Calvin. "I can see that." Calvin felt the back of his throat ache. He was not going to cry in front of 90 Hell's Angels. He made this decision absolutely. Nora came back with 2 bags. She set them down in front of Calvin and Addie without ceremony. No performance of generosity, no look of pity, just the practical placing of food in front of people who needed food. Sandwiches, 2 of them, the real deli kind. Apples. A bottle of juice each. A bag of pretzels. A chocolate bar, broken in half. Calvin looked at the bags. He looked at Thomas. "Thank you," he said. The words felt too small, but they were the only ones he had. "Don't worry about it," Thomas said, which in his mouth sounded like what it was. Not a dismissal, but an absolution. "You don't owe me anything for this. This is just what happened." Addie picked up a sandwich and opened it with both hands and ate with the concentrated efficiency of someone who'd been hungrier than chips. Calvin ate more slowly. He'd learned to eat slowly. It made the food seem like more, and it also meant he could keep watching while he ate, which was something he'd also learned. He watched the people moving between the gas station and the parking lot. He watched the way they moved, these leather-jacketed people, not chaotically, not with the dangerous randomness of the adults in his recent experience who moved unpredictably and sometimes without warning. They moved with a particular organized ease, the way of people who knew each other well and trusted the knowing. A man came and sat on the curb on the other side of Addie. He was younger than Thomas, maybe in his mid-30s, with a red beard and a cheerful face and the specific energy of someone who defaulted to friendly as a first position. "I'm Pete," he said to Addie. Addie looked at him with her sandwich in both hands. "I'm Addie." "That's a great name," Pete said. "My daughter's middle name is Addie." "What's her first name?" "Rose." Addie considered this. "Rose Addie," she said. "That's pretty." "Yeah," Pete said, like she'd confirmed something he was proud of. "I think so too." Calvin watched this exchange and felt the tension in his shoulders ease by 1 degree. Just 1. But 1 was a measurement. Thomas was looking at him when he turned back. "Tell me something," Thomas said. He said it without preamble, "No, if you don't mind," or "You can say no." Just a direct request, which Calvin found he actually preferred to the cushion versions. "How long have you and your sister been here?" "At this motel?" "Yeah." 2 nights, Calvin said. "Before that was a different motel. Before that was a shelter. Before that was the car, for 3 weeks. before the car's engine had done something complicated and expensive that their mother couldn't afford. "We move around," he said carefully. Thomas nodded. Not the nod of surprise. The nod of someone receiving a fact they'd already suspected and were filing appropriately. "School," he said. Calvin's jaw tightened. "I go when we're somewhere long enough. What grade should you be in?" "Fourth." "Starting fourth." Thomas looked at the highway. Back at Calvin. "You're smart," he said. "I can tell in about 30 seconds of talking to you." "My mom says school is—" Calvin stopped. His mom said a lot of things. Some of them are about school and its importance. Some of them said on days when she was clear-eyed and present and fully herself. She meant everything she said with everything she was. "She thinks school is important," he finished. "What do you think?" Calvin looked at the asphalt. "I think it would be easier to go if we stayed in the same place for a while." "Yeah," Thomas said. "That makes sense." The door to room 14 opened. Calvin was on his feet instantly. Old instinct. He'd learned to be between whatever came through that door and Addie before he'd even finished processing the sound. His mother stood in the doorway. Patricia and Beaumont was 31 years old, which meant she'd been 19 when Calvin was born and 25 when Addie arrived. She was thin in the way that had happened gradually over the past year, a thinning of the face and arms that wasn't the healthy kind. Her hair, which was dark like Calvin's, was pulled back with a rubber band, and she was wearing jeans and a shirt that she'd clearly put on quickly, and her eyes, when they found Calvin and Addie on the curb, had that particular relief in them that he'd also learned, the relief of someone who'd been worried and was now less worried, but also slightly ashamed of having needed to worry. Then she took in the rest of the scene. The curb. The food bags. The large man in leather was sitting beside her children. The parking lot full of motorcycles and people in leather cuts. Something moved through her face very quickly. Fear, then assessment, then a second kind of fear that was different from the first. "Calvin," she said. Her voice was careful. "Come here. Bring Addie." "Mom, it's okay," Calvin said. "This is Thomas." "He." "Come here," she said again. Same tone. He recognized the tone. It was the tone she used when she was scared and doing her best not to show it in front of people she didn't know, which she'd perfected over the past year. Calvin picked up the food bags, looked at Thomas, who had stood up from the curb. Thomas was looking at Patricia. His expression was unreadable, but his posture had shifted slightly. He'd made himself less confrontational without making himself smaller, a subtle thing that Calvin noticed and filed. "Ma'am," Thomas said. He said it the way people said it when they meant it. Not a diminishment, not a convenience, but an actual address of respect. "I'm Thomas Briggs. My club stopped at the gas station. I heard your son yelling." Patricia's eyes went to Calvin. "What happened?" Her voice changed on those words. It became her actual voice, the one underneath the careful one. "Someone grabbed Addie," Calvin said. He kept his voice flat, reporting the way he'd learned. "I yelled. Thomas came." Patricia looked at Addie. Addie had come to stand beside Calvin, her sandwich still in her hand, looking at her mother with a particular complex expression of a 6-year-old who loves her mother completely and is also, in some place she doesn't have words for yet, confused by her. "Come here, baby," Patricia said. Addie went to her. Patricia knelt down and held her daughter, and Calvin watched his mother's face over Addie's shoulder, watched the emotions moving through it, the love, the relief, the shame, the fear, the love again, love underneath everything, always. Thomas stood at a respectful distance. He didn't move closer. He also didn't move away, which Calvin appreciated. When Patricia stood up, she looked at Thomas directly. "Thank you," she said. "Your son did the protecting," Thomas said. "I just showed up." Patricia looked at Calvin. Something in her face shifted, complicated. Calvin recognized that look too. It was the look she got when she became aware of the distance between what she wanted to give him and what she was able to. "I need to," she started. Looked at room 14. "I need a minute." Thomas looked at her steadily, not judging, just looking. "We'll be here," he said. She was inside for about 10 minutes. During that time, Calvin and Addie stayed on the curb. Pete had continued to sit with Addie, talking about Rose Addie and showing her pictures on his phone. His daughter at a birthday party, his daughter at Halloween, his daughter asleep in a car seat with her mouth open in the specific way of sleeping children that is irreducibly funny. Addie laughed at the car seat picture in a laugh that was real and unguarded, the kind of laugh Calvin worked hard to engineer for her. Thomas didn't try to fill the 10 minutes with words. He sat on the curb beside Calvin, and they were quiet together, which was another thing Calvin didn't expect, that an adult could be quiet without it being uncomfortable. Most adult silence meant something was wrong. Thomas's silence meant he was just there. "What's the farthest you've ridden?" Calvin asked. He didn't know why that question surfaced. Something about the parking lot full of bikes made him curious, and curiosity was something he'd learned to suppress in the interests of being manageable, but Thomas seemed like someone who wouldn't mind it. "Alaska," Thomas said. "Took me 3 weeks." Calvin processed this. "What's it like up there?" "Cold. Beautiful. The kind of place where you feel like you might be the first person to ever see something even though you know you're not." Thomas looked at the bikes. "There's something about being that far away from everywhere that does something to your brain. Makes it quiet." "I'd like my brain to be quiet," Calvin said. Thomas looked at him sideways. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll bet you would." Patricia came out of room 14. She'd washed her face, fixed her hair. She looked more like herself than she had in the doorway, the particular self-assembly she could do when she needed to be present. She came to the curb. She didn't sit on it. She stood, which made her slightly taller than Calvin and slightly larger, which was where she needed to be. "I want to talk to this man," she said to Calvin. Said it to him directly, treated him like the person he'd been forced to be. "You stay with Addie." "Okay," Calvin said. She walked over to Thomas. Calvin watched them, Thomas's large form and his mother's careful one, standing in the parking lot with a few feet of space between them. He couldn't hear what they were saying. He watched his mother's body language, which he'd learned to read the way you read weather, the set of her shoulders, the angle of her head, and what her hands did. He watched her shoulders loosen by a fraction, the fraction that meant she'd decided something was safe. What they said, Thomas told him later. Much later, months later, when the telling felt possible, was this. Thomas asked her directly if she was okay. Not if the kids were okay, Not if the situation was okay, but if she was okay. The directness surprised her into answering honestly. She said she was not okay. She said it had been 14 months, and she was trying, and she was failing, and she knew it, and she was terrified every day, and she loved her children more than she'd ever loved anything, and she was aware that love was not enough. That love was not a substitute for stability and food and consistent school and all the things she was not providing. She said she needed help, and she didn't know who to ask because the asking felt like admitting something she was terrified to admit. Because what happened if she admitted it was that people took her children away, and she could not have that happen. Thomas told her nobody was taking her children away. She said she'd heard that before. He said, "I'm not the kind of person who says things I don't mean. I don't have a smooth way of doing things. What I have is an honest way. And I'm telling you honestly, as someone who has 2 daughters of his own, that what I'm looking at is a woman who's in trouble and loves her kids, not a bad mother. Those aren't the same thing. Trouble and bad aren't the same thing." Patricia looked at him for a long time. "What do you want?" she said. She said it the way she'd learned to say it, directly, protecting herself, asking the question that needed asking. "Nothing," Thomas said, and he meant it the way it was possible to mean that word. "Not a single thing. I'm here because your son yelled, and I heard him. Everything after that is just being a person, being the kind of person I want to be." Calvin noticed the moment his mother made a decision. He could always tell. There was a thing she did, a small lifting of her chin, a squaring of the shoulders, a look that came into her eyes that was like her original self surfacing through everything that had accumulated on top of it. The person she'd been before. The person she was still underneath. She turned toward where Calvin and Addie sat with Pete. "Calvin," she said. "Addie, come here, please." They came. Addie took her mother's hand. Calvin stood beside her. Patricia looked at Thomas. "What can you actually do?" she said. It was a practical question, the question of someone taking an offer seriously enough to interrogate it. Thomas considered it. "Our chapter has connections," he said. "We do work in the community. We've helped people find housing, navigate social services, and get connected to programs. We're not a charity organization. We're just people who know people." "The people you know," Patricia said, "are they going to judge my situation?" "No," Thomas said. He said it with certainty. "They're going to see a woman who needs a hand up, and they're going to offer one." Patricia was quiet. "My mother was a single mother," Thomas said. "She kept us together by about this much." He held his thumb and forefinger an inch apart. "I know what that looks like from the inside. I know what it costs. And I know that if someone had offered her a hand, she would have taken it and made something out of it, because she was strong enough. She was always strong enough. She just needed the weight to be a little less for a minute." Patricia's jaw worked. "I'm strong enough," she said quietly. "I know you are," Thomas said. "That's not in question." Calvin ate the rest of his sandwich and watched what happened next with the particular attention he'd learned to pay to things that mattered. What happened was not dramatic. There was no single moment of transformation, no movie scene revelation. What happened was people moving around the parking lot of the Sundown Motor Lodge, talking to each other, and the ordinary machinery of humans who wanted to help finding the specific shape of how to help. Nora, the silver-haired woman, sat down with Patricia at the small table by the motel vending machines, and they talked while Nora wrote things on a notepad she'd produced from somewhere. She had the look of someone who'd done intake assessments before, who knew the questions to ask and how to ask them without making the person feel interrogated. Thomas made phone calls. He made them without making a show of them, standing at the edge of the lot with his phone at his ear, speaking briefly, listening, and speaking again. Pete stayed with Calvin and Addie. He wasn't trying to manage them or watch them or keep them calm. He was just there, still showing Addie pictures of his daughter, letting Calvin sit in the quiet he needed. "Is this what you do?" Calvin asked Pete. He gestured vaguely at the parking lot. Pete looked at him, thought about it genuinely. "Sometimes," he said, "when the moment calls for it." "Do moments always call for it?" "No," Pete said, "but you get good at recognizing when they do." Calvin thought about this. "Thomas recognized it fast," he said. "Thomas is good at it," Pete said. "He's been doing it a long time. He lost someone. His brother, a long time ago. Guy was in a bad way and needed help, and there wasn't anyone paying attention. After that, Thomas paid attention. Like, as a full-time thing." Calvin looked at Thomas across the parking lot, his large silhouette against the August sky. "That's why he heard me," Calvin said. "Not a question. The recognition of a thing." "That's why he heard you," Pete confirmed. The sun was lower by the time the conversation between Nora and Patricia wound down and Thomas came back from his calls. He came to where Calvin and Addie were sitting. They'd moved to a shaded spot against the motel wall, and Addie had fallen asleep against Calvin's arm with the immediacy of small children who can sleep anywhere once they feel safe enough. Thomas looked at Addie asleep. Something in his face went very quiet. "Is she okay?" he said. "She sleeps like this," Calvin said. "When things get better for a minute, like her body saves it up." Thomas sat against the wall across from them. The last of the sunlight was turning everything gold and long-shadowed. "I've been talking to some people," Thomas said. He looked at Calvin directly, because apparently he'd understood, quickly, the way he understood things, that Calvin was the person in this situation who needed to be spoken to directly, who needed to know, who had been carrying the weight of not knowing for too long. "There's a family shelter in Tulsa. It's a real one, not like some of them. It's connected to a network we've worked with before. They have a program for mothers with children, real housing support, job placement, all of it." Calvin listened. "The waiting list is usually long," Thomas said. "But one of my contacts sits on the board. She's going to see if there's a spot." "Why would she do that?" Calvin said. "Because I called in a favor," Thomas said simply. "And because the situation warrants it. And because," he paused, "seemed to decide something. Because your sister should be sleeping somewhere that isn't a motel parking lot. Because you should be somewhere you can start 4th grade and stay long enough to finish it." Calvin's throat tightened. He looked at his sister's sleeping face, her cheek against his arm, her eyelashes dark against her cheek. "My mom has to want it," he said. "She has to agree. She gets to decide." "Of course," Thomas said. This is all for her to decide. We're just making options available. She's not a bad mom, Calvin said. The words came out with an intensity that surprised even him, the intensity of a 9-year-old who had been waiting for the chance to say something true and important. I need you to understand that. She loves us. She's in a hard place. Those aren't the same thing. Thomas looked at him steadily. I know, he said. I told her the same thing. Calvin blinked. You did? Yeah. In those words. Close to those words, Thomas said. Seems like something you both needed to hear. Patricia came and sat beside them. She had that look she got after crying, not the during crying look, but the after crying look, which was actually clearer, like a sky after rain. She looked at her children. Addie is asleep on Calvin's arm. At Calvin, who was watching her the way he always watched her, with the love and the worry combined in a way that no 9-year-old should be old enough to manage. Come here, she said to Calvin. He moved carefully so as not to wake Addie, transferring his sister's sleeping weight to the wall, and went to sit beside his mother. She put her arm around him, and he leaned into her side, and they were just a mother and her son for a minute, the weight of the past 14 months not gone but slightly redistributed. Are we going to be okay? He asked. He'd asked this before. He knew the various qualities of the answer. She was quiet for a moment. The good kind of quiet, not the evasive kind. I think we might actually be okay, she said. I think someone just made it possible for us to be okay. Calvin looked at Thomas, who had moved away to give them space and was now standing with a group of riders near the motorcycles, talking, his back to them. I like him, Calvin said. The words surprised him. He didn't say things like that easily. Yeah, his mother said. I think he's the real thing. She pressed her lips against Calvin's hair. You were so brave today. You know that. I just yelled, Calvin said. You stood up, she said. With nothing but your voice and your 2 hands, and you stood between your sister and something bad. That's not just yelling, baby. That's everything. Calvin felt the back of his throat do the thing he'd been fighting all afternoon. He swallowed it down. Gave it another minute. Mom, he said. Yeah. You have to let them help. You have to say yes. I know you're scared about what it means. But you have to say yes. She tightened her arm around him. I know, she said. I'm going to. Addie woke up when a motorcycle started nearby, her eyes flying open with the startled reflex of a child accustomed to sudden sounds. She looked around, saw her mother and Calvin, saw the parking lot still populated with leather and chrome, saw Pete, who gave her a small wave. She waved back. She looked at Calvin. I was asleep, she announced, as though this was investigative reporting. Yeah, Calvin said. Were you watching me? Yeah. She considered this. Good, she said, and leaned against him again, fully awake now, picking up the second half of her apple from where she'd left it. Thomas came back over as the light went amber and long. I've got good news, he said. He said it to Patricia, but he looked at Calvin too, including him in it. There's a room at the shelter. Opening in 3 days. It's a family room, you 3 together. There's a caseworker who'll meet with you Monday. The program has subsidized childcare so you can work or take classes. Patricia's lips pressed together. She nodded. There's also... Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope. He held it out to her. For the next 3 days. Until the room opens. Get a better motel than this. Get real food. Don't worry about where the money comes from, because it comes from people who wanted to give it. Not a loan. A gift. From people who've been where you are. Patricia looked at the envelope. She looked at Thomas. Her face went through several things. I don't know how to accept this, she said. You accept it, Thomas said, by getting your kids somewhere comfortable for 3 days and then walking into that shelter on Monday and making the most of the program. That's the whole repayment. That's all. Patricia took the envelope. She held it with both hands. Calvin watched her face, the pride and the gratitude and the difficulty of receiving something you need from someone you've just met, the complicated dignity of it. Thank you, she said. She said it to Thomas, and she meant it with a fullness that was bigger than those 2 words can hold. It's what you deserve, Thomas said. It's what you all deserve. He looked at Calvin. Hey, he said. Calvin looked up. I'm going to give you something, Thomas said. He reached into his jacket again and produced a card. Simple, plain, a name and a number. This is my direct number. Not the club, just me. You put it somewhere safe. He looked at Calvin carefully. If anything goes sideways. In 3 days, in 3 months, in 3 years. You call that number. Okay. Calvin took the card with both hands. I mean it, Thomas said. I don't give that out because it sounds like a nice thing to say. I give it out because I intend to answer it. Calvin looked at the card. Thomas W. Briggs. A phone number. I didn't ask for help today, Calvin said. He wasn't sure why he needed to say it. When I yelled, I wasn't asking for help. I needed him to stop. I know, Thomas said. The best calls for help aren't the ones where you're asking. They're the ones where you're just being who you are, right out loud, where someone can hear it. He put the card in Calvin's hand and folded his large fingers over it for a moment, briefly. You were exactly who you are out loud today, and 90 people heard it, and one of them happened to be close enough to do something about it. That's all that happened. That's not all that happened, Calvin said. Thomas's mouth curved. It was the first full smile Calvin had seen on his face, and it changed it, made it younger, made it warmer, opened something in it that the rest of the afternoon's seriousness had been holding closed. No, Thomas agreed. I suppose it's not. The motorcycles started leaving as the sun finished setting. It happened in the organized way they'd arrived. Not all at once, not chaotically, but in the rolling formation of people who'd done this thousands of times, who trusted the road and each other and the particular ritual of motion. Calvin and Addie watched from the curb as they went. 90 motorcycles is a large thing in motion. It fills the air with sound, a low sustained rumble that Calvin felt in his chest. Not frightening, he realized, not anymore, but purposeful. The sound of things going somewhere with intention. Nora stopped before getting on her bike. She came back to Patricia and handed her the notepad with everything she'd written on it. Names, numbers, addresses, all the specific information of how to navigate the next several weeks. "You call me if anything on that list doesn't work out," Nora said. "I've dealt with most of these people personally. They know to expect you." Patricia nodded. She was holding the notepad carefully, the way you hold something important. "Can I ask you something?" Patricia said. "Sure." "Why?" Patricia said. It was the same question Viv had asked and Calvin had asked and Thomas had expected. The basic bewildered human question of unearned kindness. "Why do you do this? Why does he?" She gestured toward Thomas, who was at his bike. "Why does any of this happen?" Nora considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Thomas's brother," she said finally. "His name was Danny. He was 26. He was struggling, really struggling, the way you are, the way a lot of people do, and nobody showed up. Nobody heard him. He died alone in an apartment in November 14 years ago, and Thomas found him." She looked at the bikes. After that, Thomas said he was going to be the person who showed up. And when Thomas decides something, that's kind of the end of the discussion. Patricia was quiet. "So we show up," Nora said simply. "Because Thomas showed us how, and because it matters. Because your boy stood up today with nothing but his voice and his fists, and he yelled loud enough to be heard, and that's the kind of thing that deserves to be answered." She squeezed Patricia's arm briefly, got on her bike. Pete stopped to say goodbye to Addie. He gave her a small stuffed animal, a rabbit, small and soft, the kind you find at gas stations, but good ones, the ones that last. "For Rose Addie," he said. "One for each side of the hyphen." Addie looked at the rabbit, at Pete. "Thank you," she said, with the grave formality of someone accepting a significant responsibility. "Take good care of your brother," Pete said. "He takes care of me," Addie said. "Yeah," Pete said, standing up and looking at Calvin. "He does. But brothers need looking after too. That's your job." Addie looked at Calvin with the expression of someone adding something to a mental list. Thomas was last. He came over when the others were mounted and the engines were beginning, that low building sound that was about to become the full rumble of departure. He stood in front of Calvin. Calvin stood up. He didn't know why he stood up, instinct maybe, or the impulse to be upright for something important. Thomas extended his hand. Calvin shook it. Thomas's hand was enormous around his, but the grip was calibrated exactly right. Firm, full, not overwhelming. The handshake of someone who was taking the gesture seriously. "You did good today," Thomas said. "You did better," Calvin said. Thomas shook his head slowly. "You did something I can't do. I can show up when I hear something. But you didn't have backup. You didn't know anyone was coming. You just stood there anyway." Calvin thought about those 60 seconds. The man's size. The sound of his own voice, cracking on sister. The shaking of his chin. The absolute decision, made below thought, to not move. "I didn't know what else to do," he said. "Most people, in that situation, would have run," Thomas said. "Or frozen. You did neither. You stood." He released Calvin's hand. Remember that. Not just today. When things get hard in the future, and they will, that's just life. You remember that you're the kind of person who stands. Calvin looked at the card in his other hand. I'll call if something goes wrong, he said. I know you will, Thomas said. And I'll answer. He walked to his motorcycle. He was the last one ready. The formation was assembled, waiting. The engines were running. Thomas put on his helmet, settled his weight on the bike. The engine of his Road King was distinctly deeper than the others, an older sound, something seasoned. He looked back at Calvin one more time, gave him a nod, a specific, complete nod, the kind that means something has been agreed upon. Calvin nodded back. Thomas pulled out of the lot. And then 90 motorcycles were on Highway 9, filling it with sound and motion, heading into the Oklahoma dusk in formation, and Calvin stood at the edge of the Sundown Motor Lodge parking lot and watched them go until the sound was just a rumble at the edge of hearing, and then nothing. His mother's hand found his shoulder. He leaned into it. Addie appeared on his other side, her new rabbit under one arm. The three of them stood there in the parking lot as the last of the light went, as the highway quieted, as the world returned to whatever it had been before 90 motorcycles had temporarily remade it. We're going to find a better motel tonight, his mother said. Her voice was different, steadier, something in it that had been missing. Okay, Calvin said. And Monday we're going to that shelter. Okay. And you're starting 4th grade, she said. Properly. Same school, start to finish. Calvin looked at the highway, at the place where the formation had been. Okay, he said. And this time the word held something different in it. Not the okay of someone managing expectations, but the okay of someone who had seen something today and filed it in the permanent place, the place that doesn't erode. 3 days later, they moved into the shelter. It was a real place, a building that had been refurbished from an old apartment complex, each family unit with its own door, a communal kitchen on each floor, a room on the ground floor with computers and children's books, and a TV that played cartoons in the afternoon. The caseworker was a woman named Beverly, who was brisk and practical and looked at Patricia with the same you-are-not-your-situation assessment that Thomas had. Calvin explored the room they'd been given. A real room, a room with a window that locked and a door that locked and 2 beds, one for him and Addie to share until they could arrange something better, and a desk. He sat at the desk and put Thomas's card in the top drawer. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it out and put it in his pocket, where he could feel it, where it was available. 4th grade started on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the parking lot. Calvin had been in 7 schools in 14 months. He'd learned to navigate new schools with the particular skill of someone who knew that being invisible was protective, and being interesting was risky, and the middle ground was a careful, watchful unremarkability that let you pass through new environments without generating friction. But this was going to be different. His mother had said that. Beverly had said that. Thomas had said that, in the way he had of saying things that were going to be true because he intended them to be. Calvin sat in the 4th grade classroom and looked around at the other kids with the skills he'd developed. He catalogued. He assessed. He was looking for the particular signals of safe and unsafe, familiar territory. Then something unexpected happened. A boy sat down next to him. His name turned out to be Nathan. Nathan had the particular social confidence of someone who hadn't learned yet to doubt whether his friendliness was welcome, who defaulted to openness as a first position and hadn't yet been educated otherwise. "Hey," Nathan said. "You're new, right?" "Yeah," Calvin said carefully. "Cool. I'm Nathan. Where'd you move from?" Calvin thought about how to answer this. The honest answer was complicated. He settled for Oklahoma City. "Cool," Nathan said again, with the same easy inflection, like all information was equally interesting and equally acceptable. "We moved from Texas 2 years ago. I was the new kid. It's weird at first, but then it's fine." Calvin looked at him. "Is it?" "Yeah," Nathan said. "Mostly. There's a few idiots, but you can mostly avoid them by lunchtime." Calvin almost smiled. "That's useful information," he said. Nathan shrugged. "I try to be practical," he said, with the unconscious mimicry of a phrase he'd probably heard from an adult. Calvin thought about Thomas, who was also practical, who had sat on a curb beside a 9-year-old and talked about Alaska and silence and the kind of people who stand. "Me too," Calvin said. He called Thomas on a Sunday in October. He'd been meaning to since school started, not because anything was wrong. Things were not wrong. They were actually, measurably, provably not wrong in a way Calvin was still learning to trust, but because Thomas had told him to call. Because the card existed. Because calling felt important as a practice, as a way of doing the thing you said you'd do. It rang twice. "Yeah," Thomas said. His voice was exactly as Calvin remembered it. Unhurried. "It's Calvin," Calvin said. "Calvin Beaumont. From the parking lot." A brief silence. "Calvin," Thomas said. And in the way he said it, Calvin could hear that he'd been remembered, that he'd been held somewhere in this man's mind, that the parking lot was not an incident that had been filed and forgotten, but something Thomas had also been carrying. "How are you? How's Addie?" "Good," Calvin said. He sat on the edge of his bed in the shelter room, looking out the window at the October sky. "Really good, actually. My mom started a job last week. It's at a medical records place downtown. She likes it." "Yeah. And I'm in school. Same school since September. I have a friend." "Yeah. His name is Nathan. He's practical." Thomas made a sound that was clearly a suppressed laugh. "Good friend to have." "Yeah." Calvin looked at the card in his hand. He'd been carrying it since August. It was worn at the edges now, the corners soft. I wanted to tell you that things are okay. Because you said to call, and I didn't want to only call if something was wrong. I wanted to call when something was right too." A longer pause. "That's a good way to think about it," Thomas said. "I think about what you said," Calvin said. "About being the kind of person who stands. I think about that." "Yeah." "I'm trying to be that. Even when it's small things. Like when Nathan was having a hard time with some older kids, I said something. I didn't do anything physical. I just said something. But I said it." "That counts," Thomas said. "That absolutely counts." Calvin nodded, looked at the October sky. "Thomas," he said. "Yeah." "Your brother, Danny." He said the name carefully. I heard about him from Nora. I hope it's okay that I'm saying this. A pause. It's okay. I'm sorry about your brother, Calvin said. I think he would have been proud of what you've done. I think he would have liked knowing that you heard a kid in a parking lot and you came over. I think that would have meant something to him. The longest pause yet. Yeah, Thomas said, and his voice had something different in it. Yeah, I think so too. Okay, Calvin said. I just wanted to say that. I'm glad you did. I'm going to do my homework now, Calvin said. I have a lot of it. Which is actually fine because it means I'm in school and there's homework to have. Thomas laughed. Not suppressed this time. A real laugh, full, the kind you don't perform. Calvin, he said. Yeah. Keep calling. I will, Calvin said. He hung up and put the card back in his pocket and picked up his backpack and pulled out his homework, a reading comprehension worksheet and some math and a short essay about a time you did something that was hard. He thought about that for a moment. About what to write. He picked up his pencil and started. December came with cold and the smell of something shifting, the particular quality of late fall that feels like the end of one thing and the not quite beginning of another. The shelter had decorations in the common room. A tree, artificial but cheerful, covered in the particular mismatched ornaments of donated things that came from 100 different places and somehow worked together. Addie had added a paper star she'd made in the shelter's after-school program, carefully applied with double-sided tape. Calvin came home from school one afternoon and found a package at the front desk with his name on it. It was from Thomas. A box, simple brown shipping, his address on the return label. He took it upstairs, sat on the bed, opened it. Inside was a book, a large, thick book called Motorcycle Adventure, 100 roads worth riding, with photographs on every page and detailed descriptions of routes, from Alaska's Dalton Highway to the Great Ocean Road in Australia to switchbacks in the Rockies. The kind of book that made the world seem wide and accessible. Underneath the book was a folded note. Calvin, every road starts somewhere. Keep your chin up. T. He read it twice. He put the note inside the front cover of the book. Put the book on the desk. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a while, this book full of roads, full of the specific evidence that there was more to the world than parking lots and motel rooms and 7 schools in 14 months. His mother came in after her shift, smelling like cold air and a new kind of tiredness, the honest tiredness of someone who'd worked rather than the gray exhaustion of everything before. She looked at the book. "Where did that come from?" she said. "Thomas," Calvin said. She looked at him, then at the book. She picked it up and looked at the cover, at the sweep of some empty highway through mountains, golden in evening light. She said. She handed it back. "Mom," Calvin said. "Yeah." "We're going to be okay," he said. Not a question. She sat on the bed beside him. She looked tired and real and present, more present than she'd been at the Sundown Motor Lodge, more present than she'd been for most of the 14 months. 73 days clean. Beverly tracked it. Patricia tracked it herself, a small calendar on the back of the room's door with XS through the days. "I know," she said. "I mean really okay," Calvin said. "Not just surviving. Actually okay." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the shelter was doing its evening sounds. Kids in the hallway, someone's television, the communal kitchen one floor up doing something that smelled like soup. "I'm working on that," she said carefully. "I know," Calvin said. "I'm working on it too." She put her arm around him. He let himself lean in, the way he'd always let himself lean into her when she was present, the lean of someone who knows the support is there. "You know what your grandmother used to say?" Patricia said. "What?" "She used to say, the thing about bottoms is that they're a floor. Meaning, when you've been as low as you can go, that's solid ground under your feet. You're standing on something real." Calvin thought about the parking lot of the Sundown Motor Lodge. The asphalt under his mismatched laces. His raised fists. The decision, made below thought, to not move. "I think we hit the floor in that parking lot," he said. "I think we did too," Patricia said. "But Thomas heard," Calvin said. "Someone always does," his mother said. "If you're loud enough." Christmas morning. Addie woke up first, because Addie always woke up first, the consistent earliest riser in any room, already awake and vibrating at 6:15 with the particular electric energy of a 6-year-old who knows what day it is. She woke Calvin by pressing her face close to his and saying his name repeatedly in an escalating volume that suggested subtlety was not the priority. "Calvin! Calvin! 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 Calvin!" "I'm awake," Calvin said, not awake. "It's Christmas." "I know. We should go see." 5 minutes. Now. He opened his eyes. Addie's face, 3 inches from his, was incandescent with excitement and the particular trust of a 6-year-old who has decided that today is a good day and is committed to it. He sat up. She was already at the door. Their mother had been up since before them. He could see it, the evidence of her having arranged what she'd arranged, small and careful under the modest tree they'd gotten for their room, a real tree, a small one that the shelter let each family have if they wanted. There were gifts. Not many, but real, chosen, wrapped. A drawing kit for Addie, the good colored pencils. A journal for Calvin, thick and leather-covered. A science kit because Beverly had mentioned he was good at science and Patricia had listened. And on the desk, beside the motorcycle book, a small framed photograph that Calvin had not put there. He went to look at it. It was from August. He didn't know how she'd gotten it. Later he would understand that Pete had taken it on his phone and Nora had gotten it from Pete and his mother had gotten it from Nora. But there it was. The parking lot. The curb. Calvin and Addie eating their sandwiches. Thomas sitting beside them on the concrete in his leather jacket, enormous and calm. His profile and their faces, the light of that afternoon's sun catching everything gold. The 3 of them on a curb, looking like people who belonged together, which they had, for those hours. Calvin picked up the frame. In the photograph, Thomas was looking at something past the camera. His face in profile was weathered and real and patient. And Calvin, 9-year-old Calvin in the green dinosaur shirt with the mismatched laces, was looking at Thomas with an expression he hadn't known he'd been wearing. It was the expression of someone who has found something solid. Who has found, unexpectedly, in a parking lot and on a concrete curb and through the voice of a large man who had decided to pay attention to the world around him, who has found something that can hold weight. He set the photograph back on the desk. He looked at his mother across the room. "Thank you," he said. She smiled. Her real smile, the one that had always been her best feature, the one that was coming back degree by degree. "Merry Christmas, baby," she said. "Merry Christmas, Mom." Addie, who had opened her drawing kit and was already uncapping pencils with the focused intent of someone beginning an important project, looked up. "Merry Christmas," she announced, including them both in it, including the room, including the tree, including everything. March. Calvin was 10 years old. His mother had 92 days. Then 120. Then, on a Tuesday in March, 150. She framed the small medallion Beverly gave her and put it on the wall beside the calendar. Calvin came home from school that day and saw it on the wall and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he got out his phone. They had a family phone now, a modest prepaid thing but real, and called Thomas. 150, Calvin said when Thomas answered. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Your mom," he said. "Yeah." "That's Calvin." Thomas's voice was that different thing, the something underneath quality. "That's real. That's hard-earned. She says she's just taking it a day at a time. That's the only way to take it."